today, the goal is that everyone leaves knowing a little bit more about organ donation. We want you to have a meaningful and informed discussion when you make decisions about organ donation. To that end, we will hear about organ donation from Amal Cheema, who is one of our community members, and Imam Abdurrahman, who we all know. So to tell you a little bit about Amal, she is a Wellesley College graduate with a degree in biochemistry and political science. Upon graduation, she was awarded the Thomas J. Watson Fellowship, through which she studied religious and cultural beliefs around organ donation in 8 different countries across the world. So Amal spent this past year interviewing religious leaders, bioethics experts, and Muslim community members during her travels in Southeast Asia and Europe. She has really put herself out there to bring us back a wealth of information. So after Amal, Imam Abdurrahman will give us the evolution of Islamic thought and opinions on organ donation. And after that, we'll have a short break, and then we'll have a question and answer and discussion session. And at that time, we'll put away this recording so that we can feel free to have an open and safe space to ask whatever you want to ask. And I'll go over just like a few ground rules, or just not too many. So while Amal and Imam Abdurrahman speak, we want you to hold your questions unless it's about a certain term that they use. We have Cheema here, who has a blue scarf, and she has some post-its and pens. She will, if you raise your hand, she'll bring you a sticky and a pen to write your question down. We will collect those questions at break time, and then we'll go over those questions afterwards. We have a dedicated session after our short break for the questions and answers. All right, so without further ado, I'm going to hand off the mic to Amal.
Thank you so much, Maham. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you all for coming. It is really great to see so many faces here and to see a curiosity to understand organ donation. Inshallah, I'd like to share with you a bit about organ donation and its background, as well as what my past year has taught me regarding religious beliefs around organ donation. I am not an Islamic scholar, so any sort of Islamic perspectives I will defer, inshallah, to Imam Abdurrahman. But I hope to share something that can either inform you about a different aspect about organ donation in the US or on a global perspective. To start off, organ donation is simply the act of donating an internal organ or another aspect of your body after you die or when you are living. Organ donation can happen in 3 ways. It can happen after a brainstem death, which is when a person no longer has activity in their brainstem due to a severe brain injury, meaning that they've permanently lost their potential for consciousness and their capacity to breathe on their own. The second way organ donation happens is a circulatory death. This is a bit rare in many countries to procure organs after, just because it is complicated. A circulatory death happens when it is an irreversible loss of the function of the heart and the lungs. And finally, people have also opted to give living donations. Of course, no one gives a living donation of their heart, but they will give a living donation of one of their kidneys or part of their liver. A liver can grow back after a resection of part of it, meaning that the person who has chosen to donate still has the capacity and chance to live a very fulfilling and healthy life. Organ donation allows for saving up to 8 lives. Of course, you can donate things like your heart and your lungs, but some people can also donate bones and veins and other aspects. These might not be life-saving, but they can be life-transforming. In the US, we also have the privilege of an organ donation system that is free, meaning that organ donation does not come at the cost of your family. It is also designed to be fair, meaning organs are fairly allocated in a way that is blind to someone's social status or their race or their age. And finally, organ donation is ethical. I spoke about the 3 types of deaths that can occur. The 2 types of deaths and 1 type of living donation. These have to be with informed consent, meaning that the person is well aware of what is happening. And additionally, organs can only be procured if someone has consented to either a kidney or a liver donation during their lifetime, for example, or after death. And that death has to be legally declared for organ donation to be brought up. Now, given that sort of foundation, I think it's really important to talk about why organ donation is relevant to us and to our community. Globally, organ shortage is getting worse. If you look at this graph, what you'll see on the x-axis is the number of years since 1991 until 2017. On the y-axis, it is the number of people. The pink represents the number of people who are waiting, meaning that they are in need of an organ. That is growing at a faster rate than the people who have been transplanted or the people who have donated, meaning that there is a greater need, and that need is getting worse with every single year, and it is not being met by the number of donations or possibilities available. This has devastating outcomes. As every 12 minutes in the US, someone is added to the waiting list, every day, 20 people die waiting for an organ that could have saved their lives. And I think it is also particularly important to think about how that might be relevant to our community. If you look at the graph on the left, you'll see that in pink it is the number of Caucasians who donate. Caucasians are more likely to donate than any other group based on just the majority status that they have. But what is interesting is that 33% of donors are ethnic minorities, while 58% of those waiting are ethnic minorities, meaning that it is likely that an ethnic minority is in a greater need for an organ transplant, but is unlikely to donate. Many of us here are also identified as Asian. Asians account for 2.5% of the donors, but 8% of those waiting. This is particularly important because donations are more successful as a method of transplantation if you receive a transplant within the same ethnic group. For example, in the UK, an ethnic minority has nearly 3 times longer waiting times, meaning that it takes them, say if it takes a Caucasian in the UK to receive a liver transplant, that takes about 3 years. For an Asian, that might be 9 years or 12 years, depending on the circumstances. That means that you're exposing yourself to a longer duration of either not being able to receive that transplant because your health condition gets worse, or unfortunately dying before that transplant becomes available. Now, given that sort of background discussing the benefits, the severity, and susceptibility of organ donation, I'd like to bring it back to why I got interested. Like many of you, I was applying for my driver's license. For me, that was at the age of 16. When I was looking at those sorts of questions, I knew that some of them would have to deal with parallel parking and other ones would have to deal with speed limits, but I was a bit blindsided by the fact that one of them had asked me to be an organ donor. As an aspiring physician, Muslim, and interfaith activist, I knew I wanted to save lives, but my hesitation to be an organ donor put me in a bit of an existential crisis. I knew that I did not know what Islam had to say about organ donation. Did Islam permit it? Was it my choice or that of my parents? What, if anything, could I donate? Why hadn't we spoken about this at Sunday school? And was my moral compass weaker because I was unsure? Looking at that sort of aspect motivated me to consider how religious beliefs might affect our support or contrarian perspective on organ donation. By the age of 21, I had reasoned through science and Islamic scripture to value life-saving over body-preserving actions, but I still wondered if other people hesitated too. I wondered what countries were doing to solve the global organ shortage, if the US was doing something similar to, say, like a country like Malaysia. I wondered why people said yes or no. And I also wondered what role education, economic factors, societal tensions, trust, culture, and religion played in organ donation. Up here, you'll see the countries that I visited. Those include Indonesia, Singapore, Malaysia, and in Europe, France, Croatia, and the United Kingdom. I picked these countries because they had an organ donation debate, they had a relative religious diversity, and that I could either speak English there or French was accessible for me to engage with the sorts of conversations that I wanted to. Curiosity in organ donation drove me to these questions, which you see all over the board here, as perhaps curiosity brings you here today. I don't mean to overwhelm you with the questions up here, but to demonstrate that organ donation is fairly more complicated than a yes or a no. It deserves a conversation. Conversations around these past 12 months have defined my year. And pursuing a Watson on the topic of religious beliefs around organ donation allowed me a rare privilege to understand what other people thought about this complex interaction between spirituality and science, an intersection where the questions about burial rights, brain death, family consent, body integrity, and fairness confronted the challenging intersection of practiced religion and healthcare decisions. In each of these countries, different sorts of questions emerge. Different cultural and ethical values lead to different systems for organ donation. These systems, in turn, reflect the prioritized ethical values of each country. Some systems work well in certain countries, but they might not be transplanted effectively into other ones. For example, depending where you are, organ donation is considered a gift, an authorization, a consent, or an obligation for a citizen. So what does that look like in practice? If you look at the system of consent, that's the second row, you'll see that France has an opt-out system. In France, every single person, every single citizen who is above the age of a child is considered to be a potential donor. I also say strict in front of it because family consent is not legally required. However, in an opt-in system, which we have in the US, every single person has to decide whether or not they want to be an organ donor and register their decision or tell their family and friends about it. There's also a variation. In Singapore, which does have the opt-out system, meaning that every citizen is a potential donor, they also have the value of reciprocity, meaning that people who are registered donors are more likely to receive a transplant if they needed one. You'll also see in the third row that organ donation rates are dramatically different. Croatia has the second best organ donation system. Spain has the best one in the world currently. Malaysia, on the other hand, has one of the lowest organ donation rates. In this sort of range, the US falls around the middle ground. It's neither good nor it is bad when it comes to promoting organ donation. And for religious diversity, there is a varying aspect. This was particularly important to me because I wanted to understand what different people of different religions thought about organ donation. But I was also interested in understanding how Muslims in different countries thought about organ donation. For example, does a Malaysian Muslim have the same perspective on organ donation as an American or British Muslim? And what role does culture play in our religious interpretation of a medical innovation that did not exist until about 100 years ago? So which of those questions did I ask? Most changed with the country, but all brought me back to the personal values that we hold, whether religious or cultural. In Malaysia, of particular note was the idea that Malay Muslims are less likely to donate than Chinese and Indian Malaysian minorities. Malay Muslims constitute nearly 60% of the population. And also, unfortunately, Malay Muslims are disproportionately represented on the waiting list. In Singapore, the question of and cultural value of body integrity was important to me. I think we all have considered the idea that we might want our body to be intact or our body to be honored. But I was wondering in Singapore whether or not that cultural value that was present in many Southeast Asian countries persisted. Particularly, I was also interested in a sort of compelling question that came with the opt-out system. Malay Muslims who are Singaporean citizens were automatically excluded from being assumed to be a potential donor prior to 2007. Why did that happen? Why did every other Singaporean citizen get to be assumed to be a potential donor, but the government decided that Muslims, in general, could not be assumed to be donors? That didn't necessarily mean that Muslims were against organ donation. What that meant was different than how it was presented in the media. Many Muslims got the idea that they could not be donors because they were not automatically presumed to be donors. But here was an interesting aspect, instead that they were required to have mandated consent, meaning that they had to get two close relatives to say that it is okay for them to be organ donors, for them to be registered. But I also mentioned that Singapore has a reciprocity system. In effect, what happened was that because Muslims were not registered as donors, they were less likely to be transplanted because the reciprocity value holds that if you are a donor, you're more likely to get transplanted. And this led to a public health crisis that in 2007, the Singaporean government engaged a dialogue with the Muslim Council to change that ruling and have now Muslims automatically assumed to be donors in Singapore. And in Indonesia, that sort of question was quite different. Indonesia doesn't have an organ donation system that's currently functioning. And in Indonesia, I addressed a very different sort of aspect. Why was organ donation considered a sin, a privilege of the rich, or a symbol of trafficking by many of the Muslims that lived in those areas? In Europe, where Muslims are the minority, those questions changed dramatically. In France, I looked at what family consent meant to different individualistic and communal cultures. In Croatia, I tried to understand why the majority homogeneous Roman Catholic belief had an impacting one of the best organ donation systems in the world. And in the UK, I looked at why Black and ethnic minorities are less likely to donate, and why particularly subcontinental Asians of a Muslim background were hesitant to become donors. And I understand that I'm leaving you with a lot of questions, and more questions than answers, but I will tell you three things. First, I don't have answers to many of those questions, but I do have observations and opinions that I would be happy to share with you. If that is relevant or interesting to you, you'll see my contact information at the end of these slides. Second, I hope that a few of these questions inspire you to do your own research and to continue to talk about organ donation with your family, friends, or strangers beyond this information session. And third, given all of these questions, what can I fairly share with you in this relatively short presentation? Well, I thought religious beliefs would play a critical role in people's opinions and support for organ donation, and it does, but not in the way that I quite imagined. No religion says anything directly about organ donation. Most religious texts predate organ donation, meaning that it is a new medical innovation that doesn't have any sort of clear guideline of how to religiously approach it. What religion and culture do provide is a hierarchy of values. In interfaith circles, we like to talk about how religion teaches us to love our neighbors and even our enemies. Most religions, if not all, uphold that saving a life is one of the best things that you can do. Perhaps religion does not tell us if we should check the box on our driver's license exam, but it does give us reason to learn and to figure out what our religious opinion is. You'll even see on many organ donation websites the sentence, "Most religions are consistent with organ donation and support it." And so I've asked myself, if this hierarchy of values seems so inclined to save lives, why would a person of faith, why would a Muslim say no to organ donation? The motivations to donate are the same, but the differences depend where you are, who you are, and what you're balancing. There are valid and respectable reasons that ultimately dissuade someone from donating their organs, from systemic distrust, to trafficking, to unimaginable grief, to the uncertainty of death, and that is okay. Our body is a vessel with which we pursue life. Our identity is intrinsically tied to it. But if you are informed about organ donation, your decision to say yes or no is sound. But we don't really talk about organ donation, at least not how to religiously approach it. I've met religious leaders who did not understand brain death and therefore found organ donation impermissible. I've met medical professionals who assumed that certain ethnic and religious groups could not donate and therefore never asked the family about their opinion. There's a lot of debate about whether education or legal systems normalize or encourage organ donation. I don't know if changing laws around who is assumed to be a potential donor will actually change people's minds about organ donation. But I do know this: if you share the facts and figures, the severity, susceptibility, benefits of organ donation, if you engage in a dialogue that respects religious, social, and cultural obligations, or if you simply ask, if you're willing to receive, are you willing to donate? People, like I did, think twice. To the people that I've spoken to about organ donation and religion, I often asked what everyone should know. Across countries, religions, and cultures, 3 things were common. First, amid this global shortage, you have a choice. Second, a woman in the UK once said to me that death is not a singular event. It happens to each of us, but it also happens to the people that we leave behind. Educating people about organ donation reduces the burden on the family in the worst moment of their life. A preempted conversation prevents the family from mourning with the uncertainty of whether or not they honored their loved one's last wish. Third, some of the most ethically complex questions can be best elucidated by the reality of a story. I have the privilege of sharing Sadia's story with you. She is a woman from the UK. This video was not taken by me. It was taken by the National Health Service in the United Kingdom. And without much further ado,
I call my baby a miracle baby, and I call myself one of the lucky ones. About 7 years ago, I was diagnosed with a kidney condition. Once I was on dialysis, I did it at home 8 hours a day, 7 days a week. Life on dialysis was very hard. I was a primary school teacher, and I ended up giving up my job because you're so tired from using the machines, you can't go out. My child was in front of me and he's sitting on the bed and I couldn't play with him, and that was the hardest thing ever. I was on dialysis for 9 months and I was on the waiting list for 11 months. So you're constantly on edge waiting on the waiting list, but you don't know if you're going to get that kidney or not. It came in the holy month of Ramadan. At 6 o'clock in the morning, the phone call came. It was a shock because I really thought I was going to get this kidney. And slowly it sinks in that your life is going to change. You're going to get your life back. You're going to be able to sit with your children. You're going to be able to go out a bit more. It was fantastic. We asked the doctor if we got any more children. Once we were stable, the doctor said to go ahead, and our miracle baby's born. Maham Zia. I could nurse him, I could keep him close to me and take him to the park, go on holiday. I'm really happy that, I've managed to do something for my baby. Part of my work is to raise the awareness. I go into schools, I go into mosques, and I raise the awareness of why you should donate. The younger generation are willing to listen and willing to change. The older generation are not there yet. They're so set in their ways. I've met people throughout my life who say, don't want to know, it doesn't affect us. Because it doesn't affect their family, they're not going to think about it. But it does affect us. It does affect our community. You're more likely to have a match if somebody from your own ethnicity. There are 3 people dying nearly every day. I made a decision to put my name down for the Urban Donor Register, and I made sure that I told my husband, my mum and dad that this is what I wanted if something happened to me in the future. I am very, very grateful to my donor. I got my life back. It does run very, very deep, the gratitude I have, and I really, really thank them from the bottom of my heart. Life is good now.
to that powerful story, I would like to add one thing. We know Sadia's name, but we don't know the name of the person who donated the kidney. In order for Sadia to live and have a kidney transplant, someone unfortunately had to pass away, and they had to have made that decision that they wanted to donate. I know you must have a lot of questions, and I think that's great. I imagine that inshallah Imam Abdurrahman will be able to address many of them, but I will leave you with 3 in the interim. First, If you or your loved ones was faced with death, would you take a life-saving transplant? Second, can transplantation exist without donation? And third, does Islam only teach us to receive and not to give? I want to sincerely thank you for your time and consideration. There are many individuals that I owe a lot of gratitude, but I won't name one because I don't think I have 365 days to go through those names. But I do look forward to your questions in the question and answer session. Jazakallah khairan.
All right, and okay, I think there's a lot, but we're not sure what's happening. Okay, so we're going to hand it off to Imam Abdurrahman, who will go over the evolution of thought on organ donation amongst Muslim scholars. So go ahead. You can pull the mic.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا الحمد لله رب العالمين. We thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for this blessed day, beautiful day. And we thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for all the great things that He has given us and the new things that we get to know. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, وَيَخْلُقُ مَا لَا تَعْلَمُونَ, that humans will keep getting to know new things. They will invent new things that they never knew before. So every time, every decade, every century has something that was never there in the past, it never existed in the past. And so is the evolution of medicine and surgery. MashaAllah, surgery started with many Muslim scholars with their surgical instruments. MashaAllah, there's many doctors here. And at the same time, the scholars also then spoke about the religious aspect of those medications or those surgeries that were invented at the time. In this, particularly in the 21st century, where we have a lot of things going on, a lot of new things are happening and happened, the scholars always took a very detailed approach, a lot of research, a lot of honesty in their findings, and every scholar put their utmost effort into that particular subject, what they were researching, and then they came with their own conclusions that perhaps it may differ from another scholar. And it is the beauty of the difference in the scholarly work, as we see the four madhahib, that each madhab in many ways they differ from one another in many aspects of our practices. How to pray, how to give sadaqah, how to go to hajj, how to pay your zakah, how to, all the different aspects of our lives. They will differ from one another based on their reasonings and based on their research and based on their works. So, if any scholar says that something is permissible, another scholar says that it's not permissible, we should respect both views. And that's why there's a saying in our tradition that ikhtilaful a'imma rahma. There's a scholar, Abu Zahra, from Egypt. He wrote a book on this subject, that why the differences of the imams and the scholars are means of mercy, because our religion is balanced out for different people, for different people's interests, their background, their style of living, their culture, and so on and so forth. Like I remember one of my teachers was saying that why the Hanafis do not recite any surah or even Surah Fatiha behind the Imam, and why the Shafi'is have to recite Surah Fatiha. It is mandatory. And he explained why, because he said most of the Hanafis are the subcontinent, Turkey and all those places, and those people they like to follow someone. They have the tradition of following. So whatever the Imam does, I'm good with that. But in other places where there's Shafi'is or Hanbalis, they have to be actively involved, otherwise they will lose out. So in Salat they have to read, they have to recite Surah Fatiha. So it's balanced out. So our tradition is a very rich tradition, and you take any issue, scholars have spoke about it in the past, present scholars speak about it, and they go into a lot of depth. As I mentioned last night, who was her last name? Raise your hand if I can see a few hands. Okay, so I would say half of the crew was there. Okay, so I mentioned this last night that as I was a student, this issue came up of organ donation, and even one of my teachers wrote a book on it. Mufti Abdurrahman from Bangladesh, and he was a great scholar, a great mufti of the Benoitan Masjid Jamia Islamia. He was of the opinion that it's not permissible, and he wrote a whole book on it, and he gave all the reasonings why it's not permissible. Before him, many other scholars also have wrote. The Grand Mufti of Pakistan previously was in India, but after partition he became the Grand Mufti of Pakistan. He also wrote an article on that, Mufti Shafi Rahmatullah. And even his teacher, Mufti Kifatullah, because I come from my Islamic educational background was mostly in the subcontinent, so I know a lot about what you never mentioned Pakistan or India. But I would like to mention about it. So before him, Mufti Kifatullah, he was one of the great muftis of the Greater India back then. And he was also of the opinion that it is not permissible for organ donations. And of course, it was a new thing. It was something that people were hesitant, scholars were hesitant. And whenever they come to a conclusion, as I mentioned, they go through a lot of research and a lot of effort. They don't just say anything on top of their head, okay, I think it's not permissible, or I think it's permissible. They have all the reasonings, and they're very honest in their opinion, honest in their findings. So Mufti Kifatullah, he actually mentions in part of his research, he says that there could be a way of making it permissible when there is a greater need. He doesn't explain a lot in depth about that, but he does hint towards that it could be permissible. So if you look at all the older researchers and scholars who have written or done some research on it, you'll find them that they were hesitant or they were against it. But later on, in the 70s and 80s, there was a little change, a shift in the scholars' opinion. And therefore, all the scholars, they say in the end what? Wallahu a'lam. This is the best that I could do. And Allah knows best, right? Over every knowledgeable person, there's someone who knows more. So nobody can say, I know everything, I have all the answers of your questions. So views change in many scholars. Like Imam Hanifa said that 1/3 of your knowledge is to say that I don't know. I will look it up. I'll find the answer. It's not always a straightforward answer for every question. So anyway, so many scholars who were against it later on, they retracted their opinion on it, and they went for it to make it permissible. I've known two great individuals. One personally I know, Mufti Abdurrahman, I think most of you know. He's the great scholar and a jurist, and mashallah, his list goes on. His institution, Darul Karachi, is one of the largest institutions in Pakistan for Islamic education. They did a research a couple years ago, and they actually went through the whole thing, and they came up with the permissibility of this whole procedure, and I have taken a few notes of them. So they said that it is permissible with a few conditions. So they say that the number one condition is that a doctor, a proper doctor, someone who has the knowledge of the whole procedure, he feels that there is no other alternative for that particular disease or dysfunctional. For example, if the kidney is failed, both kidneys are failed. I know a person can live on one kidney, but if both kidneys go bad, then you have to either, dialysis is a very painful thing, you have to go at least 3 to 4 days a week. So they feel that there's no other alternative for this particular issue, and only transplantation or organ donation is the only way out to make this person feel better, and then that will be permissible. Number two is that there is a strong possibility of once this procedure is done, that there will be a change, that the person will get better. For example, if a person needs a kidney, if we transplant, if we replace it with another kidney, the person will function again as a normal person, then that will be permissible. If there is no, maybe 2-3% or 10% possibility that it will work, then that will not be permissible, because there's not a high chance for that to be successful. And number three, this is a clause that in particular Darul came up with, that it is preferred that a Muslim should donate to a Muslim. So a Muslim should receive a Muslim's organ, and same way for the other side. A Muslim should donate for a Muslim. However, they say that it is permissible. This is contrary to another scholar, a great scholar from India, who wrote a whole research on it and presented to the Rabtat al-Alam Islami in Saudi Arabia. It's an international organization. Scholars from throughout the world come every year or multiple times in a year, and they discuss about major issues that they want to discuss. So he presented his paper, and some of his findings was, one of them was that regardless of religion, anyone can donate, Muslim to non-Muslim, non-Muslim to a Muslim, it doesn't matter. So that was his find. But according to Darul, they said that it's preferred, right? Because some people are kind of conscious about, how my organs are going to be used. So that was one. Number 4 is that the person who dies has to be of a mature age. So it cannot be a child, has to be an adult, or a mature child, 15, 16 years old. And that person must have written down in his will or has given consent, whichever way that is practiced. Or he has given wasiyah to his children, his family, his next of kin, to take care of that. So it has to be a permission, consent from the donor. Without that, then it will not be permissible. Some scholars say that it has to be from the donor, but most of the scholars who agree with the organ donations, they say that it also goes beyond that, as I mentioned, to the next of kin and the heirs of the deceased. So if the children of the deceased, after the person dies, they think that, okay, I think we should, donate whatever the need is, and then that will be permissible. If that person has no heir, has no one to take care of his will, next of kin, then the authority, the Islamic authority of the local area will take care of that. They'll have the authority to give permission or not. And number 5, that if is a person who is alive and he wants to donate an organ, that person can give the organ he or she can give that organ, but with the condition, and of course it's a very obvious condition, that it should not change any major function in that person's health. For example, a person cannot donate his eyes because it would change the ability of seeing. And a living person cannot donate a heart, according to the Islamic, or both kidneys, right? Bone marrows, it will be okay. Tissue, part of the liver, right? That will be permissible for a living person. For deceased, for a brain dead, it will be permissible to harvest any organ that is needed. Number 6, it has to be the organ has to be taken out or harvested before that body is buried. So it cannot be done after the burial. And of course, I think that's in most places they will never take out an organ from a person's already buried. Number 7, which is very important, that it has to be donated without any compensation. So a person cannot go and say, okay, I want to sell my kidney or one of my eyes, or tissue, or blood transfusion as well. Some places do that actually. There's also a big market of that. People sell their organs. You know, it's La ilaha illallah. Okay, I think so. That's pretty much it. A few more things that I would like to mention here. That according to the Shawafi and the Hanabila, they say that it's permissible to buy and sell if there's a need. So for example, there's a person who needs a kidney and there's a potential donor, but that person needs money, he's in need, a desperate need of money. And this person, the receiver, is also in a desperate need of a kidney. They can do a monetary exchange, according to the Shawafi and the Hanabila. According to the Hanafiya, some of the Hanafi scholars say that to buy an organ, that will be permissible if there's a need, but it will not be permissible to sell. So if someone, even if there's a need and if someone has to sell and take monetary benefit, that will not be permissible. But it will be permissible to buy. So, so if there's a potential non-Muslim who wants to donate, but he wants to receive monetary benefit, so it will be permissible. And for that non-Muslim, nothing will apply because the rulings will not apply to a non-Muslim, right? So in that case, it'll be permissible. I think that's pretty much what I wanted to share. Yes, I know there are, I just wanted to, one more thing that I would like to mention. There are many scholars who have taken the position of why is it not permissible. I just want to touch a little bit on that. Their reasoning are some of the ayats of the Quran and the ahadith of the Prophet ﷺ. One of the ayats that they quote normally, that وَلَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ, that we have dignified the human being. And because a person is dignified and has a certain level of dignity, it's not like any commodity that you buy and you sell and you give and you take. So it's a very precious, your body is very precious and every organ is very precious. So these transactions will eventually lead to a dysfunctional MB society. So that's their argument. And number 2 is that since Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave your body and Allah has given you your body as a trust, and Allah did not give you ownership. You have a temporary ownership of your body. And therefore, if you are not the long-term owner, then it will not be permissible. Taking that ruling, Shaykh Mutawalli al-Sha'ra was the opinion that once a person dies, his short-term ownership of his body is nullified. It doesn't have any connection, so it's because his soul is out of his body. So and therefore, it's a trust that is given back to Allah. We say, Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. He gave it back to Allah. It belongs to Allah, He gave it back. So therefore, you cannot do any organ donation from a deceased person. However, he says that it is okay for a living person. And the hadith that they mentioned is that breaking a bone of a deceased person is equivalent to breaking a bone of a living person. So because of that hadith, they say that, okay, breaking a bone, breaking any limb, or breaking any organ, or taking out any organ is the same thing, so therefore it is not permissible. Also, I mean, there's a lot of discussion on that. So these are the major reasons why they came to the conclusion that it's not permissible. So I'll just leave with that, inshallah. Yes.
So we're going to actually, I know that there's a lot of newcomers who join in the middle of the program, but we're going to hold the questions. Imam Abdurrahman, are you done, or do you have more to say?
Yeah, I think.
Okay, so we're going to hold the questions. We're going to continue at about 12:10. And if you have questions, you can either hold on to them if you just want to say them at that time, or we have Post-its, you can write them down. So we'll take a 10-minute break. We have refreshments, thanks to the Cheema family in the